Welcome to the Imagine Festival and this lecture by Claire Fox on cancelling culture and the right to be offensive. My name is Peter O'Neill. I'm Festival Director, and it's a pleasure to be able to introduce Claire this evening. As our regular patrons know, if we see controversy on the horizon, we like to steer towards it in order to explore what's going on. Middle ground is interesting, but the left and right wings of the polity are, much more exciting. So we want to provoke debates, but not trolling or abuse. So we ask you to treat all our speakers with respect, even if you disagree with their views. After all, the aim of our festival is to put ideas and politics back into the hands of ordinary people and provide an opportunity to hear about perspectives that may not necessarily come across, or indeed might even run a mile away from in terms of engaging with. So who is Claire Fox? She's the co-founder and director of the Academy of Ideas, which self-describes as creating a public space where ideas can be contested without constraint. Until it folded 25 years ago, Claire was in the Revolutionary Communist Party. She still sees herself as on the left and has indeed been described by others as a left libertarian, but she thinks left and right are increasingly redundant labels. She was elected as a Brexit Party MEP in 2019, which has probably confused her critics even more. Claire, or should I say Baroness Fox of Buckley, joined the House of Lords as a life peer last year, though she expressed her opinion and her opposition to that institution as well. So there's a definite pattern emerging of being against something, but also being willing to engage with it or join in to actively cancel it. The local elephant in the room is that if you Google for Claire, you're likely to find loads of allegations or whatever about opinions that she shared many years ago about IRA campaigns during the Troubles. Seems to be definitely old news. So she definitely has her own experience of people wanting to cancel her, and I suspect she'll be addressing that in her lecture tonight. Claire, welcome to Imagine. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and engaging with our audience's questions, which can be submitted after your talk. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really honoured to be here, and as the Academy of Ideas, we organise a big festival called the Battle of Ideas, very much in the spirit of Imagine. So I feel as though I'm amongst friends. Even if you disagree, we have the same ideas about ensuring that politics takes on and the public square takes on a life for ordinary people. So I hope I can stimulate some thoughts tonight. Okay, I'm going to talk about cancel culture. I need to start with a bit of a definition. In a letter published in Harper's Magazine last year in July, a diverse group of civil libertarians from left and right, including Salman Rushdie, J.K. Rowling, and a host of literary, cultural, and academic luminaries, raised alarm about a growing intolerance that they especially noted was on the left. And in that letter, they talked about an intolerance of any opposing views that were leading to what they called a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, that is leading to a fear for the livelihoods if people depart from consensus. Even if people make clumsy mistakes, they noted, they will not be forgiven but driven out of public life. I think that cancel culture is, for me, a ratcheting up of the free speech issue, turning it into a kind of McCarthyism that I find very disturbing. For those who say something that offends, that in a way, in free speech terms, would just mean that they would be silenced. Only a couple of years ago, there might be no platforms, and I don't agree with that. But in the period of cancel culture, you can actually lose your job for saying the wrong thing. It can have disastrous consequence for your reputation and your status in society. Those who espouse or have ever espoused views that are now considered verboten amongst a narrow group of opinion formers are not just criticised, but denounced. Complaints are sent to their employers. The aim is often to get people sacked, to get them cancelled. As I say, a modern day form of McCarthyism. There are myriad examples, and many of you will be familiar with them. But the mainstream response, despite those myriad examples, is to deny that cancel culture exists at all. It's dismissed as an overblown panic about censorship, a straw man put forward often by the right wing, they say, or put forward by the powerful who are frightened of losing their privileged entitlement to be heard without challenge. And the proof of this, which was given when the Harper's letter came out, was that all the people who had signed the Harper's letter were still employed, still in positions of authority, although it was with some irony that there was a backlash against the Harper's letter. And some of that backlash involved people who had signed the letter having their employers lobbied and mobbed on social media. And so therefore some of the signatories pulled out from having signed because they were so frightened for their livelihoods. Owen Jones, who some of you will know is a Guardian writer and well-known radical, is one of the people who argues, and I quote, "Cancel culture is just public figures being criticised on Twitter for what they've said." If only that were true. But he also said that in the same week that he called on Oxford University to fire its Deputy Director of External Affairs for tweeting about his colleague, Ash Sarkar. So I think that sometimes people say cancel culture doesn't exist while actually indulging in it. But it is true that we shouldn't use hyperbole, that there are not mass sackings as such. In some ways, it's more subtle cancel culture, and therefore I think its subtlety is its very danger. The mobbing and calling out of prominent figures rarely results in their cancellation because they are too famous, too powerful, but it does have a chilling effect on debate more broadly. So take J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling, the author, is obviously internationally well known, has 14 million Twitter followers, is a multi-millionaire, hardly can be silenced, uncancelable. So even though people call for her to be sacked by her publisher, it's not going to happen. But what about Gillian Phillip, who is a children's author, not very famous, but she was sacked by her publisher for supporting J.K. Rowling. And that was after 24 hours of abuse and complaints being aimed at the publisher, who eventually caved in. I just want to explain a little bit how it works. I haven't myself been cancelled. I mean, I am never off the telly, according to my critics, and I actually don't ever take any platform for granted. I'm always surprised and delighted to be asked to speak, as I am tonight. But I do worry about the fact that so much pressure is put on others when I am invited to speak, and it can be quite intense. So to use an example, I often get invited to speak at universities, but the university student societies who invited me enthusiastically persuaded me to go and speak, then come under an enormous amount of hassle, get a lot of stick. The student union has to fill in endless forms. The college authorities say that I might be threatening the safety of their students, not because of anything I do, but because my ideas might upset people. And as a consequence, even though I go ahead and do the talk, I can see in the eyes of the student organisers that they might not bother asking me again because it's been so much hassle. I recently, during lockdown, I was invited to go on BBC's Any Questions on Radio 4. And I noticed on social media that the producer and the presenter were copied into thousands and thousands and thousands of tweets abusing me. I was trending before the programme had even happened, before I'd said a word. So I didn't say anything offensive, just the invitation itself was enough to get them under attack. And they really had to put up with some vile abuse for inviting me on the programme. I did the programme, wasn't that controversial. But I happen to know from some of the people on the production team that they did think they might be wary of inviting me again because it was just such an unpleasant experience for them. So you can understand when employers worry about the reputational damage of not responding when somebody is labelled as a bigot, when complaints come either from their own staff or customers about someone. Because just like people's experience of inviting me, they just think this is so much hassle. We don't want people to think that we're endorsing these ideas. The argument is put forward by people who say you should sack so-and-so because of their opinions, that his or her opinions make different myself or identity groups, whoever it is, feel unsafe and under threat. It becomes a heckler's veto. And you can see that institutions and corporations are really nervous about not acquiescing to this, and they therefore act on the basis of a minority but loud group of people. And actually, sadly, ordinary people are, as a consequence, finding that their reputations are being besmirched and they're even losing their jobs. I want to whiz through a few concrete examples of the way cancel culture works. Last year, on the 50th anniversary of the first Women's Liberation Conference that was set up to celebrate the social struggle of women's equality, it was in February last year. Selina Todd, a left-wing feminist scholar who was absolutely well-renowned as being somebody associated with the fight for women's equality, and particularly for giving working-class women a voice in academia, she was cancelled as the person who was going to open the conference the night before it happened. Why? Because after some targeted lobbying by activists and other speakers at the conference who were told that she was a bigot, they then threatened to pull out and boycott the event, and the organisers eventually caved in. Professor Todd's crime was that she was a vocal opponent of the government's Gender Recognition Act, which is subsequently been sidelined, but she upholds women's sex-based rights. And it just seemed to me to be so awful that at a feminist conference, a historic conference, that a well-renowned historian like Selina would in fact be cancelled in such an undignified fashion. And that is the fate of many gender-critical feminists. And Selina Todd herself now has police guards when she teaches in Oxford University, remarkable. But nonetheless, she's also a well-established professor. But can you imagine what it's like in universities if you're a postgrad student or you're just a student and you share the same kind of views as that? You would have got the message loud and clear about the fate of Selina Todd, that you shouldn't go there, that certain issues are verboten, you're not allowed to discuss them. And it's the way that I think cancel culture works, that nobody's necessarily cancelled, but you end up in a situation of self-censorship in case you might be cancelled, because certain ideas are demonised as bigotry. Recently in the House of Lords, there was a debate about the new Maternity Bill, a bill which I fully supported. But my heart sank when I realised that the Maternity Bill didn't include the word woman and instead used persons who are pregnant. The reason my heart sank was not just because that was ludicrous, but because I knew I was going to have to oppose it. I knew that I was going to have to argue for sex-based rights and that we should recognise women and that we shouldn't allow them to be women to be erased from, of all things, a maternity bill. But I didn't really want to do it. You know, I really wanted a quiet life. I didn't want to be one of the people that would then be labelled transphobic. As it happens, I did, and so did many other people in the Lords, and eventually the government backed off, and there was a compromise in which the word mother was inserted, even if not woman. But nonetheless, it was kind of frightening how I knew myself that that topic was one that I really wanted to avoid. And I really think you have to understand the consequences. Joanna Cherry, a prominent SNP spokesperson, somebody I disagreed with on many an occasion, just the week before that maternity bill was in the House, was sacked by Nicola Sturgeon after other SNP activists denounced her for signing up to a pledge stating that women have the right to refuse consent to males in single safe spaces. And the fact that she was sacked just showed you that you have to be careful what you thought or said. Another example is Nick Buckley on another issue. Nick is the founder of an award-winning charity supporting young homeless people in Greater Manchester. And when I stood as an MEP when I was an MEP for the Northwest of England for the Brexit Party, wherever I went in the Northwest, I heard about Nick Buckley's work. A really well-respected guy. During the lockdown, after the brutal killing of George Floyd, he wrote a blog that was critical of Black Lives Matters in the wake of the uprising after that killing. What did he say in that blog? He said that he didn't want young people to think the UK was inherently racist. He said that he didn't want them to believe that the system was constructed to fail them, that he didn't want them to think that the police were out to kill them. Instead, he advocated personal responsibility and working hard. It doesn't matter whether you agree with him or not. I mean, if you disagree with him, then write another blog back. But instead, what happened was a petition was set up to get him sacked. Now, only 400 people signed that petition, but nonetheless, a corporate sponsor threatened to withdraw funding from the charity. The trustees panicked. Nick's contract was terminated of a charity he'd set up himself. As it happens, Nick launched another petition himself, was brave and took it on. He got the support of the Free Speech Union. He got an article in the Mail, which was very helpful. He got 15,000 to support his petition, but nonetheless, the lesson, and he's been subsequently reinstated. But nonetheless, you could see that just the very act of criticising Black Lives Matters led some to giving a knowing nod that Nick had dodgy views. There was an inference that he was racist. And I know colleagues who work in the arts who, because they refused to put a black ribbon around their Instagram picture as it was mandated by their employers in arts organisations, were also similarly treated as though they were somehow racist. What's really peculiar and worrying for me is that it's not even what you say that matters. Increasingly, free speech itself is characterised as somehow dodgy. There's a new book that's just come out by a guy called Gavin Titley that's called Is Free Speech Racist? And he actually says, quote, freedom of speech has been adopted as a primary mechanism for validating and amplifying and reanimating racist ideas. So even arguing for free speech might make you think that I've got something to hide. But it's such a disgusting slur that if you're for free speech, you only want that free speech so that you can be a racist or a white supremacist. I think it's something we should all be very wary of. But I can't avoid the fact that, of course, some people do have repellent and bigoted views. Some people are racist. What about them, you might well ask? One of the most tricky issues that all of us face is how we adhere to a principle of free speech when we are asked to defend the indefensible. But I think that's because too many assume a false premise that defending freedom of speech of the rights of bigots amounts to an endorsement of their views. It's a kind of guilt by association, and itself is used to get people cancelled. But for me, the principle of free speech is too foundational to democracy to be surrendered to bigots. And I agree with Thomas Paine, who in 1795 made the point, quote, he that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression. For if he violates their duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to himself. And indeed, we've seen that happen. Some who have advocated cancelling right-wing bigots are today themselves being cancelled using the same precedent. Sadly, too many people actually on my side of the argument, on the free speech side, wallow when people they disagree with are cancelled in this way. And I do want to just in passing note that saying that it's good that people who are pro-censorship get a taste of their own medicine are cancelled is not good enough for me either. I don't like tit for tat cancelling because I think it sets a precedent for people, anyone to be cancelled for their ideas. But I have to take on board the arguments put forward by people like Zoe Williams, a respected journalist, who said that cancel culture is a coded attack on marginalised minorities for having the gall to criticise people with large platforms. Maybe she's right. Or Nesrin Khan, who says that those of us who moan about cancel culture are confused by a lack of reverence by newly active and vocal activists telling the old guard they are wrong and irrelevant. So maybe I'm just kind of old school and I don't like the new kids on the block. She says that it's not a baying mob out there trying to cancel you, but an audience who have only recently found their voice and marginalised voices who are telling you to think through your opinions. Maybe that's what it is. Well, I now want to consider those marginalised voices and think about what that tells us. And I want to tell the story of Buckley Grammar School in Yorkshire that's all over the news at the moment. But before I tell that story, I want you to consider two things. Who really has the power to decide what's offensive and who should be cancelled? And I suggest that we're seeing the emergence of a new clerisy who speak on behalf of the offended and marginalised to act as new censorious power breakers. And I want to note the use, also when I tell this story, I want you to note the use of safety as an excuse for closing down free speech, an issue that I think is particularly pertinent in a pandemic. Okay, Buckley Grammar School in Yorkshire. There, a teacher showed his pupils images of the Prophet Muhammad in an RE class, a religious education lesson, in an attempt to discuss religious tolerance and censorship. That shouldn't be contentious. In a free society, teachers are free to interpret the curriculum and illustrate it as they want. But according to local religious activists, this should not be tolerated. So even though we haven't got a blasphemy law, and even though religious sensitivities is not a consideration in state education, these activists have shut down the school for 2 days. There's pickets and protests, and they have exacted a grovelling apology from the head teacher of the school, who has now suspended the teacher, and that teacher is in hiding for fear of his life. Even now, the protesters outside the school say that that's not enough. They're not satisfied. They're demanding the teacher is sacked, and indeed other teachers who supported him must also be sacked. In other words, proper cancellations are demanded. But it's interesting to listen to the language used by protesters and supporters. And for those who think that I'm here to have a go at Islam or to make some point about Muslims, absolutely not. Because if you listen to the language, it's not the language of religious fundamentalism at all. It's actually the language used by broader cancel culture advocates. They sound more like managerial bureaucrats and student union types than anything else. So the community leaders, who happen to be Muslims, but they accuse people of, quote, using freedom of speech as an excuse to justify hurting somebody's emotions and sentiments. They said that the showing of the images was done in a threatening and provocative manner, quote, leaving the children concerned for their safety and well-being. And they said that the teachers had failed in their safeguarding duties. So a lot of emphasis on well-being, safety, and so on there. It seems to me to be remarkable that that teacher has been abandoned by people in the establishment. Teachers' unions have just stayed silent. One of their own has been suspended, has been forced into police protection for their own safety, and yet the teachers' unions have not said a word. Why? Because it's controversial and they're worried they'll offend local activists. Local Labour MP Tracy Brabin even said that she was, quote, pleased that the school recognised it was inappropriate and apologised. The Guardian managed to outdo itself in its analysis by having a headline that says, in the constituency where MP Joe Cox was murdered, the town's still a far-right battleground. So somehow it managed to turn into a far-right issue rather than an issue of people demanding the equivalent of a blasphemy law. And then you have other commentators, one who accused critics of peddling, quote, Islamophobia couched as freedom of speech. But of course, that's exactly the point. People are frightened to speak up in case they're accused of Islamophobia. And Baroness Syed, who sits in the House of Lords with me, Syed Varsi, suggested that showing the cartoons was indeed fueling Islamophobic bullying. And I think in the context of the French teacher Samuel Paty, who was beheaded in France for a similar offence only last year, that we should be wary of an establishment who actually cannot bring themselves to defend this teacher. The headmaster, Gary Kibble, declared the lesson actually completely inappropriate and said that it had the capacity to cause great offence to members of our school community. But I just ask, and as we speak, teaching materials are now being removed from the school, and there's a promise of an audit of learning tools to follow to make sure they're not offensive. And then just wonder about this precedent. If teenagers can now demand that teachers are sacked for using teaching content that might be deemed offensive by them or their parents or local activists, where on earth does that leave teacher autonomy? In general, I'd say that increasingly those in power are not the old establishment guard, but those who shout, I find that offensive most loudly. And indeed, in hate crime legislation, it is those who say that they perceive as an alleged victim, and that's given precedence over objective reality, that they are offended or that they have been on the receiving end of hatred, that will actually get you into trouble. Claims for identity-based protection of the vulnerable, lived experience and anecdotal evidence now trumps any attempt at arguing for principles, free speech or facts. In 2019, Harry Miller, a businessman and ex-constable, was contacted by Humberside Police. The complaint was an offended party said that he was a bigot because he shared a poem on social media that was called transphobic. During the conversation, the police conceded that although his poem was not illegal, it was being investigated as offensive, and that they had visited to investigate a non-crime hate incident. And to note, between 2014 and 2019, there was 120,000 non-crime hate incidents recorded in England and Wales by the police. And those, by the way, are kept on your record and can mean that you will never get a job because you're described as somebody who's perpetrated a hate offence. The police then told Harry Miller, "We need to check your thinking." That is a chilling phrase. We need to check your thinking. I think what we're seeing here is the emergence of thought crimes. And that teacher at Buckley School is also accused of a thought crime. And is accused of only showing those images because he was involving himself in purposefully offensive, hateful behaviour rather than acting as a teacher. This sort of approach means that victims who allege that they offended can accuse others of the most malign motives and label them bigots. And that is an approach that's not just prevalent in the police, but also affects overzealous HR departments, senior management teams, and throughout the political and cultural elites. Let me assure you, the civil service is rife with that approach. There are now officially sanctioned beliefs, a suite of opinions that if you differ from them, you can be labelled a bigot. In Robin DiAngelo's book, famously that on every book list, and a compulsory reading in many institutions, it promotes the idea that all white people are inherently racist, and any denial is proof of unconscious bias. Indeed, unconscious bias training is now being wheeled out throughout institutions, and if you resist, then you're in trouble at work because it's seen to be proof that you are actually secretly a racist. And it's this kind of thing that I think is the background to cancel culture. The problem for me is that the new power brokers are always on the side of the marginalized. They always say they are, but they actually are the people who are in power, and they explicitly argue that people don't go along with the new norm should be cancelled. I was really struck by what happened with Amnesty International Ireland last year, that along with another 26 NGOs published a letter demanding the silencing of everyone who, quote, seeks to defend biology or fight gender identity, such as those contemptuously dubbed as pseudo-feminists who push gender-critical thinking. It even suggested that they should be denied political representation, i.e. cancelled as citizens. And to give the quote, "We call on the media and politicians to no longer provide legitimate representation for those who share these bigoted beliefs." So for anyone who thinks that cancel culture is a myth, I'd urge you to think on that. But also when listening to the Buckley story, I asked you to consider the issue of safety. And it's no coincidence that activist councillors in Yorkshire emphasise safety and safeguarding of pupils, because safety is now the byword for a new form of censorship. Safety is a moral good that trumps all of the values, we're told. And even though the only person whose physical safety is at risk in the Buckley story is the teachers, somehow the psychological safety of the pupils is deemed to be more important. Indeed, psychological safety is a new mantra. Universities have safe space policies to protect students from dangerous ideas. Speakers are now platformed for ideas that are said to threaten the psychological well-being and safety of students. J.S. Mill's harm principle has now been reinterpreted through the eyes of therapeutic understanding of harm as we speak. Greg Lukianoff, the American writer and free speech leader, explained it this way. He said, people are all over the globe are coming to expect emotional and intellectual comfort as though it were a right. An over-diagnostic culture that's reframed distress and emotional pain as forms of mental illness rather than aspects of healthy human experience. To feel upset is not an aberration, it is a sign we are alive, and yet to feel upset can get you cancelled. Can give you justification to cancel someone. And I wrote about this safetyism and its creation of cotton wool kids and Generation Snowflakes in my book a few years ago. I find that offensive, but that has now developed so that free speech itself is said to be dangerous and a threat that can harm the vulnerable, and those who argue for it a danger to society. This has become visceral and literal over the last year with the COVID pandemic. The notion that free speech or loose words are harmful has been translated as shut them up or they'll kill granny. Lockdown skeptics, for example, are accused of having blood on their hands, of deadly beliefs. There's a kind of hysterical response, which you saw with the Great Barrington Declaration, where people like Sunitra Gupta, professor of theoretical epidemiology at the University of Oxford, was personally and professionally maligned with a demand that she was removed from the public sphere in a kind of witch hunt that we haven't seen before. And it was said that her ideas as a scientist were dangerous. Demands that TV and radio stop inviting anyone who is a lockdown skeptic, even if they were a scientist, onto the screens or onto radio, was accompanied by big tech companies being deployed to silence any dissenters and regulate debate. Look at the way that YouTube declared that if anyone published anything that contradicts the World Health Organization's recommendations, that content would be removed. I note that skeptics are accused of denialism as a kind of category of denier, and obviously that brings it into the moral framework of Holocaust denial, and not questioning or interrogating the establishment positions is now a kind of generic evil of free-floating blasphemy. In 2019, one of the newspapers updated its style guide, for example, to change climate skeptics instead to be referred to as climate science deniers. I think that word denier is important in this cancel culture debate. That same rhetorical strategy has been applied to those who are skeptical about lockdown policies, who are accused of being COVID deniers. I actually was added to a list of COVID deniers by a minister of the government because I actually argued for civil liberties and against the extension of the coronavirus legislation, because I'm a civil libertarian rather than I deny anything. I think that gross exploitation of the legacy of the Holocaust also leads to that kind of McCarthy atmosphere that I spoke about at the start. One Tory MP, Neil O'Brien, the MP for Harborough, actually has a list which he's compiling of anyone he considers to be a COVID denier, agents of gross misinformation. And on that list, there are thoughtful people who question policy of a complete lockdown, who worry about the collateral damage of cancer, education on the economy, but they are depicted in an interchangeable way with those who are indeed anti-vaxxers, who are the kind of contrarians who argue that having a vaccination is the equivalent of getting a microchip so that Bill Gates can monitor our behavior. But they're all lumped together as COVID deniers. So to conclude, I fear in an era of cancel culture that it's leading to a destruction of free and open-minded discussion, that in turn that harms society far more than any incorrect opinions or even the risk of hearing bigoted opinions. And remember, it's not so much the speakers who lose out, but the listeners, the audience. We, the public, are deprived of hearing certain views as decided by a minority of activists, a new clerisy speaking on behalf of marginalized or vulnerable communities who decide for us what we should hear. It's infantilizing and dangerously narrow-minded. Cancel culture limits the space for critical interrogation of public policy and orthodoxies. It narrows down the possibility of a social debate about issues, and it demonizes those who dare voice any reservations about whether what we're doing is the best way forward. It delegitimizes those who entertain the possibility that we might be on the wrong path on any number of different issues. And I think we need to argue for an open and rigorous inquiry, and we should cherish dissent. Skeptical dissent and free speech encourage society to question the assumptions that they've taken for granted for too long. We should be able to question truths. We want to be able to shake up the ossification of a narrow set of ideas, which otherwise will become dogma. Cancel culture is ultimately conservative. It refuses to allow our intellectual life to yield to new experiences or diverse voices. Dissent and free speech is an antidote to the status quo, and without it, social change, to my mind, is impossible. So for all of those social justice warriors in the audience who think cancel culture is their friend, I'd say that free speech is your ally, not your foe. And the greatest threat to democracy and social justice today is indeed cancel culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire, for that passionate defense of free speech. And now it's an opportunity for our online audience to contribute. We can vote up and down the questions that have been submitted. And we now have a bit of time to thrash out some of the issues that Claire has so eloquently raised. Now, one of the questions that has come in really right from the start, and this is a very gentle opener for you, Claire. and this is, can you please define the difference between freedom of speech, legal in brackets, and freedom from social consequence?
Well, I mean, there is consequence to speech, of course. Otherwise, why would I be giving this speech? I'm trying to persuade people. Speech is a powerful weapon that we all have. So I don't think that for example, speech has no consequence. In fact, one of the accusations that's sometimes leveled is that if you speak, you shouldn't accept criticism, or some people will say, oh, you just don't want to be criticized. But actually, I think that free speech is exactly what we need to criticize other people's opinions. So I would imagine the consequence of saying something is that somebody will say, I disagree with you. They might decide they don't like me. It might confirm their prejudices. They might denounce me. That's all fine. That's all fine. I mean, I don't expect people to kind of nod along. That would be pathetic. So, of course, free speech does have social consequences, but the inference is that somehow speech is dangerous, and it's usually posed as a kind of, it will incite hatred, or it will incite violence, if you want, sort of some that you will. But I think that's quite insulting to an audience, isn't it? Because if you think about the kind of apocryphal, kind of far right rally or something, somebody can stand up and give a speech and say, go out and launch a racist pogrom. But the audience are full of morally autonomous individuals who can hear that and make their own minds up. And some people might say, I'm going to go out and be a racist. They might think that. Other people might hear that and say, you, the speaker, are a bigot. I don't disagree with you. They're not going to just do it. They're not attack dogs, so you can just go do this and they do it. So I think that the consequences are not quite as black and white as people imply. That's the point I'd make. And I'd rather know who my bigots are, by the way. I always think that I want to know what people really think so I can argue against it and assess them based on what's in plain sight than driving it underground.
Thank you for that. And Richard Taylor has put his name to this next question, where he asks, is it time to drop the left-right identity from our discourse and talk more of values that shape our policies?
I think so. It's really difficult for me because, I was the publisher of LM, Living Marxism, for a few years, and I'm from a left-wing background. And I don't like it when people say, oh, you've joined the right. They usually mean you're a free speech. You're a free speech advocate. That must mean you're right wing. That's usually what they mean. Or your Brexit party, which in some areas equates to right wing, when in fact that's a nonsense. Because as we know, that cut across left and right, whether you voted to leave the EU or not. And actually, I came from the Tony Benn school of being anti the European Union. So I'm of an age where I'm still reluctant to abandon the notion that I'm from the left, the point I'm making. I don't like it when people kind of try and say it doesn't matter. But the truth is, I don't really know what it means anymore. And the identity left has definitely led the attack on free speech. So that's problematic for me. But, it's also the case that we have a conservative government that has tried to bring in the Gender Recognition Act and tried to have a maternity bill that didn't use the word woman. So we have woke Tories too. So I don't know what the left-right thing works anymore in quite a straightforward way. So the values that I value are freedom. And I don't think that freedom is a right-wing concept, which is why when people say, they usually spit it out and say, oh, you're just a libertarian. They're trying to insult me by implying I'm right-wing, but I think that over-flatters the right. It suggests that they own freedom. Whereas I actually think I'm an Enlightenment thinker, and the history of Enlightenment thought that brought us both left and right is that we all believe in freedom of speech.
Tanya Jackson asks, do you believe that hate speech can exist as a crime?
I don't think, well, first of all, the difficulty with the concept of hate speech is that the definition of hate is absolutely unclear. And, you know, I've read every single definition because it's something I'm very interested in. And they actually all contradict each other. And in the end, the definition is resolved by saying that it's based on the perception of the person at the receiving end of it, which, as I tried to indicate, is a kind of form of subjective response, which is very dangerous, because then everyone can say you were motivated by hate. To then turn it into a crime, which is what at the moment the government are considering doing, is particularly egregious as a consequence of that. So at the moment, there's just been actually in the House of Lords, through an amendment in the House of Lords, the government have agreed to roll out a national policy of counting misogyny as a hate crime and so on. So apart from the fact that nobody can decide what misogyny is, by the way, you'd think it might mean hatred of women, but in terms of crime, it's used to describe everything from catcalling, unwanted approaches, which I always make the point is, how do you know they're unwanted if you're, I mean, that's like, what's that about? But, you know, catcalling rolls into the sort of absolute horrors of the brutal killing of Sarah Everard, you know, all part of the same thing. And then the police are asked to count how many examples there are of misogynistic hate crime. And then the actual wording in the bill is based on the perception of the victim or a third party. So somebody else can say, I saw somebody being catcalled and they didn't object, but I'm telling you, Mr. Police person, that you've got to count it as a hate crime. So I think it's incredibly dangerous, and I would get rid of the category of hate crime. I think it's just censorious. And by the way, the criminal law itself deals with anything which is criminal, if you see what I mean. So this is just added on as a way of criminalizing, I think, opinion.
Yeah, Tanya agrees with you 100%, but Oris makes an interesting point. In Scotland, the hate crime bill has just been passed, but excludes protection for sex/women, but cross-dressing is included, according to Oris.
She makes a good point. So the added complication in gender critical terms is that the Scottish hate crime were not even prepared to defend women. I mean, it's unbelievable, really. It's been removed from the bill. There is now an inquiry into it run by Baroness Kennedy. I mean, there's so many baronesses around. I've now discovered why the Lords are more influential than I'd ever thought. I'm not, but they are. But anyway, Baroness Kennedy, so they call, I don't know, of the Shores, is running this sort of separate inquiry as to whether it should be in. But that hate crime legislation in Scotland is so draconian, it's really frightening. And one of the things there is that it gives the state the right to define what is offensive in the privacy of your own home. It removes the dwellings exemption. So you can be reported by a third party. So you can be having a dinner party or a party or anything in your own house, chatting to your mates, and something you say can be listened to by somebody else who came with a friend of a friend, who can then report you and say what you said was bigoted, and the police can then act, and you can be criminalized as a consequence. I mean, you can't, I mean, it's been described as more draconian than anything in any other part of the world. And to add insult to injury, it can't even bring itself to introduce misogyny because it can't bring itself to defend women as women.
And Sam asks, do you think free speech in Western democracies is more seriously under threat now than any other time in history?
Yes. Although I suppose any other time in history, that would be ludicrous. You know, during the, you know, pre the modern era, if you want, you know, pre the Renaissance, if you think about it, the church dominated what you thought and said, you know, in the medieval period, for example. So you had this kind of flourishing of freedom in the ancient world, in ancient Greece and in Athens. And, you know, we kind of know that's where it started. But then for centuries, it was eradicated and wiped out. And it was the church that decided what you were able to think, say, in public and so on. There was a dominant view. And part of the emergence of the modern world from the Renaissance and then flowering in the Enlightenment was a recognition, or was the idea that the individuals should be considered to be responsible for their own thoughts and views, and that we should remove this kind of overburdening of, you know, this dictatorial idea about what was acceptable or not. And that emerged in the flowering of democracy and modernity. So of course there's been a period, but I do genuinely feel like we're regressing. It feels to me like we're closing in, and I you know, I spoke for a bit long anyway, but you know, the number of topics that are now forbidden is incredible. They just grow all the time. When I was a student many decades ago, no platform was considered to be used very particularly against people who are far right fascists. And I mean, I don't mean these days you can get called a far right fascist for hardly anything, but I mean people who were proudly members of the National Front, who basically were openly racist, and no platform was deployed to stop them speaking at universities. They didn't particularly want to speak at university, but that wasn't the point. Now, no platforming has grown massively to incorporate so many things. And of course, partly it's anything that somebody else finds offensive or that would be seen to be psychologically or emotionally harmful. And so I think that it's squeezing out the number of opinions that are now acceptable. And I think I mentioned, I have this kind of idea that there's a suite of opinions that you're allowed to have. It's like a tick box, you kind of go through it. We all know what they are, really. And if you divert from those, you can be in trouble. And sometimes inadvertently, even your language might be incorrect. You know, you might say a word that suddenly has been deemed to be representative of bigotry and only changed a week ago. You know what I mean? And if you say the wrong word, that somehow people will assume or something, and so on. So yes, I'm worried.
Valentine has been on for a while. He was wondering, is it fair to introduce those you defend by their job titles when introducing those you oppose as well-known radicals? I think this was at the very start of your speech when you were referencing, was it Jones, the Guardian journalist, when you introduced him? As I say, it's
We don't know.
Maybe
maybe I've made some great major faux pas. I wasn't sure who was familiar with who or who would know who. I wasn't trying. There was nothing clever in that, let me assure you.
And again, just to remind people, this talk is available on YouTube and, you know, can be looked at later.
And also, I disagree with Owen Jones on you know, so much couldn't make it up. But I went on his YouTube channel just a few weeks ago, and we had a conversation, and I made the point to him there. It was largely about kind of Brexit and the arguments on the left about Brexit, but we did have a little moment on cancel culture. And I made the point to him that, you know, maybe to his surprise, maybe to my surprise, you know, we had a civil conversation. And that's what free speech is. You know, I don't expect people to agree with me. I don't expect that. I'm not going to agree with Owen Jones because he tells me I should. But we are capable as grown-ups of exchanging views. That's the point. And we both learned something about each other's views from having that conversation. So it was broadly a positive. And I mention it because I got a lot of stick for doing that in conversation with him from gender critical feminists, because they can't stand him because they think he's betrayed women, and it's a long story, but to do with Suzanne Moore in The Guardian. I got stick for going on the programme, so people want me to stay in some kind of echo chamber where I don't engage with him, and he got stick for having me on because I'm obviously a right-wing fascist because I stood for the Brexit Party, and the Brexit Party was run by Nigel Farage, and therefore I'm a racist, and therefore etc etc. But actually, we both ignored that, did the conversation, and I think generally more light was shone on the issues than not.
And we're going to have to wrap this up relatively soon, but Emma Wallace asked, for example, does it have to be a crime committed? So then the crime part element is motivated really by race and gender. So therefore, someone is not committing a crime for saying hateful things, but more the hate crime element is the motivator for the crime.
Yeah, but that's where the thought crime comes in. So you can think that, right? So if you're a woman and somebody hits you, right? the crime is the hitting, yeah? And if you're on the receiving end of it, to be honest with you, whether it's motivated by somebody hating all women and misogyny, hating you specifically, me, Claire Fox, or because they're drunk, or having a breakdown, or robbing something, or whatever, right? I mean, the motivation is quite a tricky one, right? And there are, of course, in court terms, you know, in legal, civil, criminal court, they might say, well, this seems to be aggravating circumstances, blah, 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 this happened. But in most hate crimes, it's entirely speculative. You know, unless somebody says, I hate her because I hate all women, you don't know what the motivation is. If then you ask the victim, I could say, he hit me, or even he said something horrible because he hates all women, it's misogyny. But that's just my opinion, right? So that's why it becomes thought crime. And when you then in the law say a third party can decide, and there's something that's just come out actually where the police have actually, or is hate crimes against police are the most prosecuted hate crimes, which did make me laugh, but anyway, and actually the first person who was ever found guilty of a hate crime was a black guy who was a guy who attacked the police, and he was accused of racially aggravated hate because the police person was black. Right now, I mean, maybe they were, I mean, do we know? Or does anyone know? And so that's why it's very dangerous to have that in the law.
And maybe just to finish up then, Declan from South Belfast asks, where do you see us all in 10 years' time?
Singing in a circle, singing Kumbaya and all peace and life. Right, I think there needs to be a concerted effort to defend freedom of speech. That's the point. It won't happen spontaneously. It's not going to be, you know, this festival that you organise. I hope that we, by the way, in 10 years' time, will be face to face with not a hint of social distancing or mask wearing or anything else. And then we can have a proper discussion. But that's one side. A festival such as this will not be able to thrive and survive if free speech continually gets squeezed like this, because you will be under pressure about who you invite to speak, what topics you address, and so on and so forth. And I know I'd just like to apologize on my, you know, that I know you've had some stick for inviting me, and, you know, you haven't got that many people in the audience, because actually what people would prefer to do is to attack you for inviting me on social media, you know, try and use that to kind of put pressure on you or embarrass you, and then they don't turn up for the debate. You know, that is kind of typical. And I think also what it will mean is that for young people, this is the greatest tragedy, is that they won't learn the importance of understanding that one opinion is not just given as right, you know, that they need to dig beneath issues, you know, that the headline needs to be investigated, that when you take any topic, there's always two sides, not 3, 4, 5. There's lots of grey areas. And that actually you don't want to get dogmatically stuck on an issue. And they will not, you know, the other thing, and J.S. Mill always made this point, you know, the way that you learn how to argue, the way that you develop your arguments is to test them out in the public square. And sometimes you have an argument, you realize that it's a rubbish argument, even as you're saying it, you know, you're under pressure. But that's how you change your mind on things. So when I was 18, 19, 20, 21, I had opinions which I do not have now because people argued against me. I read a few books. I have opinions now that I didn't have 2 years ago. That's where it goes.
Hi, Claire. I think we've lost Pete there on his internet connection.
Yes, I don't know who's lost. I thought it was me that was lost.
No,
so
we've still got you. Thank you very much. I think Pete was actually starting to wrap up. So on behalf of the Imagine Festival, thank you so much for appearing. I hope everyone's had a great time. And yes, as Pete mentioned, it will be on Facebook and YouTube if people wish to look back. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you for having me.